Hello, brave and beautiful girls, and welcome back to Girls Who Rise. I'm so glad you're here. Before we start, let's place one hand on our heart. Take a slow breath in and let it out. And remember, you matter. Your imagination matters, and your voice matters. This podcast is a place for big feelings, brave hearts, and stories that help us grow. Today, we're stepping back into the world of Anne of Green Gables, where ordinary roads can become enchanted, where thoughts are dramatic and wonderful, and where one girl's imagination changes everything. Now, before we begin the next chapter, I want to remind you of something important. Anne of Green Gables was written a long time ago, and the world was just a little different then. The sentences were sometimes longer, and the language wandered, just like Anne's thoughts often do. In this version, the story has been gently abridged. That means it has been trimmed just a little so it flows more easily when read aloud, while keeping the heart, the imagination, and the spirit of Anne exactly as L.M. Montgomery intended. Nothing important has been taken away, only what might slow the story or make it harder to follow today. This is still Anne's story. And now, get cozy, take another slow breath, and let's begin. Anne of Green Gables by L.M. Montgomery. Chapter 4. Morning at Green Gables. Anne awoke at the very first silver shimmer of the morning. For one confused second, she did not know where she was. The ceiling above her was white and slanted. The air was still and soft. No babies were crying. No harsh voice was calling her name. No one was rushing her awake. She lay perfectly still. Then the memory returned in a warm rush. Green Gables. She sat up abruptly, her braids tumbling down over her shoulders. Sunlight streamed through the small pane window, glowing through the thin white curtains and laying long golden bars across the quilt. "It wasn't a dream," she whispered. She slipped out of bed and crossed to the window, pressing both palms against the glass. Outside, the orchard was in bloom, every tree a cloud of white blossoms trembling in the breeze. Beyond it, the fields rolled out in soft green waves. The sky above was wide and clear, brushed with the faintest streaks of rose. Anne took a deep, slow breath. "I always imagined," she murmured, "that if I ever truly belonged somewhere, the morning would look just like this." She dressed with great care, smoothing her faded dress as neatly as possible. She braided her hair tightly, though a few rebellious wisps escaped at once. She paused at the small mirror and regarded herself thoughtfully. "You must try to look useful," she told her reflection. "Useful girls are kept." Downstairs, Marilla Cuthbert had already begun the day. The kitchen at Green Gables was orderly and clean, with a square table set precisely and the morning light bright against the polished floor. Marilla believed firmly that discipline was the foundation of a proper household. When Anne entered, she hesitated just a little inside the doorway. "Good morning," she said carefully. Marilla looked up briefly. "Good morning. Sit down." Anne obeyed at once. She folded her hands in her lap and tried to sit very straight and quiet. Matthew entered shortly after, moving softly, as always. He gave Anne a shy nod, and she returned it with a hopeful little smile. Breakfast began in near silence. Anne lasted nearly a full minute. Then she glanced toward the window, and the sight of the orchard overcame her resolve. "It is the most beautiful morning I have ever seen," she said earnestly. "The blossoms look as if they were scattered by fairies in the night." Marilla poured the tea without looking up. "They were scattered by nature," she said calmly. "There is no need to improve upon it." Anne blushed. "Yes, ma'am." But after a moment, she added, "It must be very lovely to wake every day and know exactly where you are." Marilla paused. "Anne," she said firmly, "nothing has been decided. Matthew has sent word to Mrs. Spencer about the mistake." The word mistake fell between them. Anne's fingers tightened under the table. "I understand," she said quickly. "I know you wanted a boy. Boys are very useful." Matthew shifted uncomfortably. "I can be useful," Anne continued in a rush. "I can help with children. I am very good at imagining pleasant things when work feels tiresome." That is not a practical skill, Marilla replied. Anne nodded. No, ma'am. After breakfast, Anne insisted on helping with the dishes she washed carefully, though she held each plate as if it were something delicate and precious. When a soap bubble caught the sunlight, she paused. Wow, she breathed, lifting it gently. It has a rainbow inside it. Marilla pretended not to notice, but she did notice that the child handled every dish with anxious care, as though afraid that one careless movement might send her away. Later, Marilla showed Anne the yard. The lilac bushes were in bloom, their fragrance thick and sweet. The barn stood sturdy and weathered. The brook ran quietly along the edge of the property, glinting in the morning sun. Anne walked around slowly, drinking it all in. Does the brook have a name? She asked. It is simply the brook, Marilla replied. Anne considered this gravely. I think I shall call it the Lake of Shining Waters, she said at last. It sounds much more hopeful. Marilla almost smiled. Almost. You can call it what everyone else calls it, she said instead. Anne nodded, though her eyes continued to shine. Throughout the morning, Marilla assigned small tasks, sweeping, folding linens, carrying wood. Anne performed each with determined effort. She did not complain. She did not chatter excessively. She seemed to sense that this day mattered deeply. Yet even while she worked, her imagination slipped through everything. The orchard became a cathedral of blossoms. The barn rafters held mysterious histories. The path through the trees suggested adventure. At midday, when Marilla paused to observe her, she found Anne standing very still near the lilac bushes. What are you doing? Marilla asked. Trying to remember this, Anne said softly, in case I must go. Marilla's lips tightened. You must not indulge in unnecessary sentiment, she said. Yes, ma'am. But when Anne turned away, Marilla felt an unfamiliar discomfort, something that felt suspiciously like pity. And Marilla Cuthbert did not easily surrender to emotion. By afternoon, the sky had deepened into a clear, steady blue. Anne sat briefly on the back steps, watching the bees drift lazily among the blossoms. I think, she said to Matthew quietly, who had paused nearby, that even if I am sent away, I shall always remember this morning. Matthew looked at her long and carefully. Best not to think about that yet, he muttered. Anne nodded. But hope, fragile and persistent, had already begun to take root. Inside the house, Marilla stood at the window. She had intended to correct a mistake. Yet as she watched the thin little figure moving carefully among the flowers, she found that the word mistake did not feel quite as certain as it had the evening before, and that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Chapter 5. Anne's History. The afternoon light lay warm across the kitchen floor when Marilla finally spoke. Anne, come sit here. Anne came at once and seated herself at the table. Her hands were folded neatly, but her fingers twisted together in small, anxious motions. If you are to remain here, Marilla began in her steady way, even for a short time, I must know something about your past. I cannot keep a child whose history I do not understand. Anne nodded. Yes, ma'am, I think that is very sensible. Anne took a breath and for once did not rush into speech. My parents died when I was a baby, she began quietly. They had been school teachers. At least that's what I've been told. I like to imagine they were very kind and very clever. I think they must have been, because sometimes I feel as if I remember being loved. Though perhaps that is only something I invented. Marilla did not interrupt. I was sent to live with Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, Anne continued. They had 4 children of their own, and then 3 more came after I did. There was always washing to do and babies to rock. A small smile flickered across her face. I became very good at rocking cradles. I could do it with 1 foot while I peeled potatoes. Marilla's mouth tightened slightly, but she listened. I tried to be helpful, Anne said earnestly. I truly did. I thought if I were useful enough, perhaps I would feel less extra. Extra? Marilla repeated. Yes, like a cup on the shelf that does not quite match the others. There was a small silence after that. When Mrs. Thomas died, Anne continued, her voice softening, there was no more room for me. And then? Marilla prompted. I went to live with the Hammonds. They had 8 children, twins twice. I helped feed them, dress them, quiet them. She paused, and for the first time her voice wavered. It is very difficult to feel important when you are one among so many. Marilla shifted slightly in her chair. And when Mr. Hammond died, Anne went on, his relatives did not wish to keep all the children. So we were sent to the orphanage. She said the word plainly, without self-pity, but the air in the room felt heavier. There were many girls there, Anne continued. We slept in rows. We worked in rows. We tried not to cry in rows. She lifted her chin. I decided if I could not belong anywhere real, I would belong somewhere imagined. Marilla's eyes sharpened. What do you mean by that? Anne's expression changed instantly, brightening, almost glowing. I made friends, she explained, invisible ones, girls with beautiful names and perfect manners. I gave names to the trees outside the windows. I pretended the wind was speaking kindly to me. That sounds like foolishness, Marilla said, though not unkindly. Yes, Anne agreed readily, but it was comforting foolishness, nonetheless. She leaned forward slightly now, her gray-green eyes intent. Do you know what it feels like to want something so much that you can almost see it, but never quite reach it? Marilla did not answer. I always wanted, Anne continued slowly, to stay, just once, to unpack my things and not wonder how long I would be allowed to keep them out. The quiet in the kitchen deepened. Anne's hands were still now. I tried not to hope too much, she admitted. It hurts less when you do not expect to be chosen. Marilla rose and crossed to the window, though she did not seem aware that she had done so. Outside, the orchard shimmered in the afternoon light. Bees moved lazily among the blossoms. And when Mrs. Spencer told you you were coming here? Marilla asked. Anne swallowed. I tried not to imagine it, she said honestly, but I did imagine it anyway. She looked down at the table. I imagined being wanted. The words were so simple that they carried no drama, only truth. And this morning, she added very quietly, I tried not to love the orchard too much, in case I must leave it. Marilla stood very still at the window. For years she had believed that sensible decisions were the only kind worth making. Yet something about the child's steady, unadorned honesty unsettled that certainty. At last, she turned back. That will do, she said, but her voice was not quite as firm as before. Anne rose at once. Thank you for listening, she said with complete sincerity. And in that small, sunlit kitchen, something had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Chapter 6. Marilla Makes Up Her Mind. That evening, the house at Green Gables felt unusually still. Supper had been cleared away, the lamps were not yet lit, and the last of the daylight lingered softly along the walls. Anne had gone outside. Marilla stood at the kitchen table, folding a dishcloth with careful precision. Matthew lingered near the door. He cleared his throat once. Marilla did not look up. Well, she said. Matthew shifted his weight slightly. She's a bright little thing, he began quietly. Marilla continued folding. That is not the question. Matthew nodded. She works hard. So would a boy, Marilla replied. There was a pause. Matthew rarely pressed a matter, but tonight something in him seemed steady. She doesn't complain, he added. Marilla stopped folding. We asked for a boy, Matthew, a boy to help with the farm, a boy strong enough to manage the fields. Matthew looked toward the window where the orchard was turning dusky and blue. Yes, he said gently, but perhaps we were meant to have Anne. Marilla frowned slightly. That is not how arrangements work. No, Matthew agreed. but sometimes things work out differently than we plan. Marilla resumed folding, though her movements were no longer quite as brisk. She talks too much, she said. She'll learn. She is fanciful, said Marilla. Matthew gave the faintest hint of a smile. Yes. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it was full. At last, Matthew spoke again. She needs us. The words were simple, without decoration. Marilla did not answer immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and stood at the window. Outside, Anne sat on the back steps, her small figure outlined against the fading sky. The sunset had begun to spill pink and gold across the horizon. The orchard trees were darkening, their blossoms now shadows. Anne's hands were folded in her lap. She was very still. Marilla watched for a long moment. She will expect too much, Marilla said at last. Children like that do. Matthew did not respond. She has been disappointed before, Marilla added quietly. Yes, Matthew said. And then, after a moment, so have we. Marilla turned slightly at that, but Matthew had already lowered his gaze. Outside, Anne drew in a slow breath. If I must go, she whispered to herself, I shall not cry until I am out of sight. She lifted her chin bravely. I shall remember the orchard, she said, and the lake of... She caught herself. The brook, she corrected softly. Behind her, the door opened. Anne sprang to her feet at once. Yes, ma'am? Marilla stepped down onto the small wooden landing. For a moment, she simply looked at the child. Thin shoulders, tightly clasped hands, the determined effort to appear calm. You have had a difficult childhood, Marilla said, her voice even. Anne blinked in surprise. Yes, ma'am? And yet, Marilla continued, you have not grown sour. Anne's eyes widened slightly. I try not to, she said honestly. Marilla folded her hands. It is not sensible to make decisions based entirely on feeling, she began. Anne caught her breath. But it is also not sensible, Marilla continued, to ignore what is plainly before one. Anne stood very still. You may stay at Green Gables, Marilla said. The words hung quietly between them. Anne did not move. For 1 second she simply stared, as if she feared the sentence might change shape. Stay? She whispered. Yes. The realization dawned slowly like sunrise across her face. Her lips parted and her hands trembled. Oh, she breathed. And then the breath broke into something brighter, something fierce and joyful and almost disbelieving. Oh, Marilla! She stopped herself abruptly. I mean, yes, ma'am. Marilla's mouth twitched slightly. You need not address me as if I were the queen, she said. Anne's eyes filled suddenly. I will try, she said earnestly. I will try every single day to be exactly what you need. You need not be exactly anything, Marilla replied. You need only to behave properly, learn your lessons, and mind your duties. Anne nodded vigorously. I can do that. I truly can. She hesitated. And I shall try not to imagine quite so much out loud. That would be an improvement, Marilla said. But her voice held the faintest trace of warmth. Anne looked back at the orchard, now dim in twilight. I shall never forget this moment, she said softly. Marilla followed her gaze. It is only a practical arrangement, she said. But even Marilla knew that was not entirely true, because something had changed, not just for Anne, but for Green Gables. Anne clasped her hands once more. To be wanted, she said very quietly, is the loveliest thing in the world. Marilla turned toward the house. Come inside, she said. It will be dark soon. Anne followed her up the steps, and as the door gently closed behind them, Anne Shirley entered Green Gables, not as a mistake, but as someone who was wanted. Okay, girls, what did you think? Wasn't that such a tender part to the story? The thing I keep thinking about in these chapters, and what I would like you to think about too, is how quiet everything is, and yet how much is happening underneath it all. No one is racing, there's no one shouting, nobody's making big speeches. Instead, everything is happening in small amounts. Anne wakes up in a new room. She looks out at the orchard, and she tries not to love it too much. She washes dishes carefully, she tells her story honestly, and she sits on the steps at sunset and prepares herself to leave just in case. Marilla folds the towels. She stands at the window and she thinks longer than she usually does. Matthew doesn't say much, but he watches and listens. And when he finally speaks, it matters. There aren't fireworks, there aren't dramatic rescues, and yet you can almost feel everyone holding their breath. It feels like everything is waiting. And if we look closely at how each person behaves, we can see that something bigger is happening underneath all those small moments. Anne talks more when she's nervous. She works extra carefully, and she tries to prove she's worth keeping. Marilla grows quieter than usual, and she observes. She hesitates before speaking. And then there's Matthew, who rarely says much at all, but chooses this moment to speak up. She needs us. That is not just a sentence, that's feeling. So let's name those big feelings, because when feelings have names, they aren't quite so scary. They're feelings like uncertainty, vulnerability, and relief. Uncertainty is that unsettling feeling you get when you don't know what's going to happen next. And we can see uncertainty in all three of them. Anne wakes up unsure. She tells her story unsure. She sits on the steps unsure. And Marilla stands at the window repeatedly unsure. Matthew waits quietly in the kitchen, unsure. Vulnerability is when you let someone see the tender part of you, even before you know how they will respond. Anne shows vulnerability when she says something like, I felt like a cup on a shelf that didn't quite match the others. Marilla shows vulnerability when she lets herself care, even though she had planned not to. And Matthew shows vulnerability when he speaks up, even though he usually stays quiet. He watches and listens, and he says almost nothing for most of the chapters. But when he finally does speak, she needs us, it helps Marilla decide. And relief? That's the warm exhale that comes when the waiting is over and your heart can finally rest. We see relief when Marilla says, you may stay. Anne feels it. Matthew feels it. Even Marilla feels it, though she shows it very carefully. All three of them are moving through the same big feelings, but they process them differently. Anne feels her feelings out loud. Marilla feels her feelings carefully, and Matthew feels his feelings quietly. Some people talk their feelings through, like Anne. Some people think their feelings through, like Marilla. And some people hold them close and speak only when it matters, like Matthew. None of these ways are wrong. They are just different ways of being human. So, as we close today's story, remember this. Uncertainty does not last forever, even though sometimes it feels like it might. So, when you're thinking about your big feelings and you can't seem to find the answers will come, especially if you slow down, take a gentle breath, quiet the noisy thoughts in your mind, and listen to that small, steady voice inside you. When you do that, you'll begin to notice that you've been holding the answer all along. I want you to always remember, you are not too much. You belong here. You are someone who is meant to be here, and you matter. And as we keep reading along Anne's journey, we will keep noticing these big feelings together. Thank you for listening. I had such a great time. Until next time, be gentle with your heart. Keep noticing your thoughts and feelings. And remember that being hopeful, curious, and a little unsure is a part of being brave. I can't wait to keep reading with you and see where Anne's journey takes us next. Until next time, see you then.